An ominous encounter. Ellie couldn't sleep. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, vivid and unsettling. The rhythmic drumming, the spectral boy, the silent warning, all of it had left an indelible mark on her. She had witnessed something extraordinary, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the apparition was more than a passive echo of the past. It wanted her to understand something. Callum was uncharacteristically quiet as they ate breakfast in the castle's cafe. Usually quick with a sarcastic remark or a skeptical jab, he seemed lost in thought, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. "You're awfully quiet this morning," Ellie said, trying to lighten the mood. Callum glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I'm just trying to wrap my head around what we saw." "You were right, Ellie. Something is here. But what are we supposed to do about it?" Ellie didn't have an answer. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee and looked out the window at the castle courtyard, where the day's first visitors were starting to gather. A disturbance in the air. By mid-afternoon, Ellie and Callum were back in the research office, poring over documents and maps. Ellie was focused on the tunnels beneath the castle, the ones where the drummer boy was said to have disappeared centuries ago. She hoped they might hold clues to his identity or his connection to the castle's violent past. Callum was scrolling through digital archives on his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. He paused and frowned, tilting the device toward Ellie. "Look at this," he said. Ellie leaned over, her eyes scanning the screen. It was an old newspaper article from the early 1900s, detailing an unusual incident at the castle. Visitors had reported hearing drumming, followed by a collapse in one of the underground chambers. 3 people had been injured, and 1 had died. "What's interesting is the timing," Callum said. "The collapse happened the same night the drumming was heard. Coincidence?" Ellie shook her head, a chill running down her spine. The drummer boy's appearances always seemed to precede something catastrophic. "Maybe he's not just a warning. Maybe he's trying to stop it." Callum snorted. "You think a headless ghost is playing hero?" Ellie didn't respond. She had seen enough to know that the truth often defied logic. The apparition returns. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of gray and orange, Ellie decided to revisit the Great Hall. It was the site of their first encounter with the drummer boy, and she hoped it might hold more answers. Callum reluctantly agreed to accompany her, though his nerves were visibly fraying. The hall was quiet when they entered, its vast expanse shrouded in shadow. Ellie's footsteps echoed on the stone floor as she approached the far end of the room, where they had seen the ghostly boy the night before. "I don't like this," Callum muttered, his voice low. "Just a few minutes," Ellie said. "If he's here, we need to understand what he's trying to tell us." They stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, the air around them growing colder with each passing second. Then, faint at first but unmistakable, the drumming began. Ellie's heart raced as the sound grew louder, resonating through the room. The rhythmic beat was deliberate, almost urgent, as though the boy were summoning them. The temperature dropped sharply, and Ellie could see her breath in the air. Callum shivered beside her, his skepticism rapidly dissolving. "I think we've overstayed our welcome," he said, his voice trembling. But before they could move, the figure materialized. The boy appeared just as he had the night before, dressed in a tattered military uniform, his drum hanging from his shoulder. This time, however, his presence was more vivid, his ghostly form radiating an eerie glow. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the boy raised his drumsticks and began to play. The rhythm was frantic now, each beat reverberating through the room like a warning bell. Then he stopped. The boy lowered his drumsticks and turned toward them, his headless body somehow exuding a palpable sense of urgency. He raised one hand, pointing toward the far wall of the Great Hall. Ellie followed his gesture, her eyes narrowing as she tried to discern what he was indicating. The wall was blank, its surface unremarkable except for a few cracks in the stone. "What does he want us to see?" Callum whispered. Before Ellie could answer, the boy's hand fell, and he began to dissolve, his form fading like smoke in the wind. The drumming echoed one final time, then ceased altogether. The silence that followed was deafening. The hidden chamber. Ellie approached the wall cautiously, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. She pressed her ear against it, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. "There's something here," she said, more to herself than to Callum. Callum frowned. "It's a wall, Ellie. A very solid, very old wall." Ellie ignored him and began examining the surface closely. Her flashlight revealed a faint outline near the base of the wall, a rectangular shape, partially concealed by centuries of grime and dust. "It's a door," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "A door to what?" Callum asked, his tone skeptical but tinged with curiosity. "Let's find out." With Callum's help, Ellie began clearing away the debris. The stone door was heavy and stubborn, but after several minutes of effort, it creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that descended into darkness. The air that wafted out was stale and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Ellie's heart pounded as she shone her flashlight into the passage, the beam illuminating a steep staircase carved into the rock. "Are you sure about this?" Callum asked, his voice laced with apprehension. Ellie nodded. "The boy showed us this for a reason. We have to see where it leads." The warning fulfilled. They descended the staircase cautiously, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, and Ellie felt a growing sense of unease. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a small chamber. The walls were lined with rusted iron chains, and the floor was littered with fragments of bone. Ellie's flashlight revealed a crude inscription carved into the wall. "Beware the stone of wrath." "What does that mean?" Callum asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Ellie could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling, and a low rumble echoed through the chamber. "We need to get out of here," Callum shouted, grabbing Ellie's arm. As they scrambled up the staircase, the rumbling grew louder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Ellie glanced back, just in time to see the chamber collapse, a cloud of dust and debris billowing toward them. They burst out of the passage and into the great hall, gasping for air. Behind them, the hidden door slammed shut, sealing the destruction within. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "He was warning us," Ellie said finally, her voice trembling. "He knew the chamber was unstable. He saved us." Callum shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and awe. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Ellie stared at the now sealed door, her mind racing. The headless drummer boy was more than a ghost. He was a guardian, protecting the castle and its secrets from those who would disturb them. But what lay beyond that chamber? And why had the boy chosen her to uncover it? The answers, Ellie knew, were buried deep within the castle's dark past, and she was determined to find them. The drummer's legacy. The morning after their harrowing encounter in the Great Hall, Ellie sat in the castle's cafe, her notebook open on the table and a lukewarm cup of tea beside it. The air outside was brisk and gray, the sky threatening rain, but she didn't notice. Her mind was fixed on the apparition of the headless drummer boy. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, something buried not just in the castle stones, but in the memories of the city itself. The locals, Ellie knew, were often the keepers of such tales, preserving oral histories that the official records ignored. Callum slouched across from her, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. He looked worse for wear, his normally sharp demeanor dulled by the events of the previous night. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "what's the plan?" "Another late-night rendezvous with our headless friend." Ellie shook her head. "Not yet. We need context. If the drummer boy really appears before disasters, I want to know what the locals have to say about it." Callum raised an eyebrow. "You mean you want to sift through centuries of ghost stories?" "They're not just stories," Ellie replied, her tone firm. "Legends like this don't survive unless there's truth at their core." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Fine, but don't expect me to charm anyone. That's your department." Ellie smirked. "You're more charming than you think, Callum, when you try." Whispers of the past. They began their inquiry in a small pub just outside the castle grounds. The place was a labyrinth of low wooden beams and faded tartan decorations, its walls lined with old photographs of Edinburgh. It smelled of ale and hearth smoke, and the air buzzed with the quiet murmur of patrons. Ellie approached the bartender, a stout man with a thick beard and a weathered face that spoke of decades behind the counter. "Excuse me," Ellie said, offering a warm smile. "I was wondering if you might know anything about the headless drummer boy at the castle." The bartender's face darkened. I know the tale," he said, his voice gruff, "but it's not one I care to dwell on. Bad luck, that boy." "Bad luck how?" Ellie pressed. The bartender wiped his hands on a rag, glancing around as if to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "Whenever folk hear his drum, it means trouble's coming. War, famine, death. Take your pick. The lad's a herald o' misery, if you ask me." Ellie scribbled furiously in her notebook. "Do you know when he was last seen?" The man frowned, his brow furrowing. "Not sure. Been years, I'd wager. But some claim to have heard him before the Second World War. The castle was a barracks then, and they say the soldiers heard drumming in the dead o' night. Weeks later, war broke out." Ellie nodded, her pulse quickening. This was exactly the kind of connection she was looking for, a tapestry of tragedies. Their next stop was an antique shop tucked away in a narrow alley. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. McCready, was more forthcoming than the bartender. She greeted them with a knowing smile, her gray hair pinned back beneath a tartan shawl. "Ah, the drummer boy," she said when Ellie mentioned the legend. "I've heard the tales. My grandmother used to say his drumming was a call to arms, a warning that blood would soon be spilled." Ellie leaned forward. "Did your grandmother ever see him?" Mrs. McCready shook her head. "No, but she heard the drum once. It was just before the Rising o' 45, when Bonnie Prince Charlie's men marched on the city. She said the castle's defenders were restless that night, muttering about hearing a ghostly drum. The next morning, the rebels attacked." Ellie jotted down the account, her mind racing. Each story seemed to add another layer to the drummer boy's legend, reinforcing the idea that he was tied to moments of upheaval and violence. "But there's more to it than that," Mrs. McCready continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The drummer's tied to the land itself, they say, to the stone o' Castle Rock. Whatever binds him, it's older than the castle, older than Scotland, maybe." Ellie's pen faltered, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" The woman shrugged, her expression turning somber. "There are things in this world we weren't meant to understand, lass. The drummer's just a piece of it, a shadow of something darker, the curse of the drummer." As the day wore on, Ellie and Callum continued to collect stories, piecing together a fragmented tapestry of the headless boy's legend. They spoke to an elderly man who swore he'd heard the drumming during the 1970s, just before a fire broke out in the castle's armory. Another local recounted a chilling tale from the early 1800s, when soldiers stationed at the castle reported seeing the boy days before an outbreak of cholera swept through the city. Each account added to the sense of foreboding that hung over the drummer's appearances. He wasn't just a ghost, Ellie realized. He was a harbinger, a warning of death and destruction. Callum, however, remained skeptical. As they walked back toward the castle, he voiced his doubts. "Don't you think it's a bit convenient?" he said. "All these disasters, all these sightings. It's easy to connect the dots after the fact. People want to believe there's meaning in chaos." Ellie shook her head. "It's more than that, Callum. The drummer isn't just a passive observer. He's trying to tell us something. Last night, he pointed us to that chamber. He wanted us to see it before it collapsed. Or he led us into a death trap," Callum muttered. Ellie stopped walking and turned to face him. "You saw him, Callum. You heard the drums. Doesn't that make you wonder why?" Callum met her gaze, his skepticism wavering. "Maybe, but I still think we're in over our heads." Ellie smiled faintly. "That's where the best discoveries happen. The night drumming. That evening, as the castle's gates closed and the tourists dispersed, Ellie and Callum prepared for another night of observation. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the drummer boy would return, and she wanted to be ready. They stationed themselves near the castle keep, where the air was still and heavy with anticipation. Hours passed in silence, the darkness growing thicker with each passing moment. And then it began. The drumming was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew steadily louder, each beat resonating through the stone like a heartbeat. Ellie felt her chest tighten as the sound enveloped them, filling the air with its eerie cadence. She turned to Callum, her eyes wide. "Do you hear it?" Callum nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I hear it." The sound seemed to move, circling them like an invisible presence. Ellie's flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of the boy. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. The headless drummer boy stood before them, his form glowing faintly in the night. He raised his drumsticks and began to play, the rhythm more urgent than ever. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she watched, her mind racing to decipher his message. "What does he want?" Callum whispered, his voice trembling. Ellie didn't answer. She was transfixed by the boy's movements, the deliberate precision of his drumming. He seemed to be pleading with them, his headless form exuding an almost palpable desperation. Then, abruptly, he stopped. The boy lowered his drumsticks and pointed toward the castle gates. Ellie followed his gesture, her stomach sinking as she saw what lay beyond. In the distance, a figure stood at the edge of the courtyard, shrouded in darkness. It didn't move, but its presence was undeniable, a shadow that seemed to pulse with malevolence. The drummer boy's form began to dissolve, his warning delivered. As he faded into the night, Ellie felt a wave of dread wash over her. "Something's coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Callum nodded, his face pale. "And I don't think we're ready for it." Dreams of the forgotten. Ellie hadn't meant to fall asleep. After the events of the night, after the boy's frantic drumming and the shadowed figure by the gates, her nerves had been strung too tight to even consider rest. She'd spent hours poring over her notes and sketches, trying to connect the ghostly warning to the castle's long and bloody history. Callum had retreated to his room shortly after their return, muttering about needing sleep to maintain his sanity. Ellie had stayed behind in the office, determined to uncover something, anything, that might explain what they'd witnessed. But as the clock ticked past 3 a.m., exhaustion took hold. The pen slipped from her hand, and her head sank onto the open notebook, her breathing slowing as the darkness of the room folded around her. The first dream. At first, it was peaceful. Ellie was standing on a windswept hill, the grass beneath her bare feet soft and cool. The air smelled of earth and rain, and in the distance, she could see the faint outline of Edinburgh Castle, its walls gleaming in the twilight. But as she moved closer, the scene began to shift. The sky darkened, clouds gathering like a heavy curtain. The grass beneath her feet withered, turning brittle and brown, and the air grew thick with the metallic tang of blood. Ellie stopped, her pulse quickening as she realized the ground around her was littered with bodies. Soldiers in tattered uniforms lay sprawled across the hillside, their faces twisted in pain. Blood soaked the earth, pooling in dark rivulets that ran toward the castle like veins. She tried to move, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. A sound reached her ears, a faint, steady drumming that seemed to grow louder with each beat. Her eyes darted toward the castle, where the headless drummer boy stood silhouetted against the battlements. He raised his drumsticks, and the rhythm changed, becoming frantic and uneven, as though he were summoning something. The air around Ellie grew cold, and the ground beneath her began to quake. The bodies on the hillside stirred. One by one, the fallen soldiers rose, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glowed with a dull, sickly light as they turned toward Ellie, their mouths opening in soundless screams. The drummer's rhythm reached a fever pitch, and Ellie tried to run, but the earth opened beneath her, swallowing her whole. A startling awakening. Ellie woke with a start, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She sat upright, blinking against the dim light of the office, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her notebook lay open before her, the ink smudged where her head had rested. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, the vivid images of the dream still fresh in her mind. "Get it together," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair. The sound of footsteps startled her, and she turned to see Callum standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Ellie managed a weak laugh. "Something like that." Callum crossed the room, and perched on the edge of the desk, his arms folded. What happened? Ellie hesitated, unsure how much to share. The dream had felt so real, as though she'd been transported into another time. But Callum was already skeptical of her theories, and she didn't want to give him more reason to doubt her. Just a bad dream, she said finally. Probably from everything that's happened. Yeah, well, that makes two of us, Callum said, rubbing the back of his neck. I couldn't sleep either. I kept hearing that damn drumbeat in my head. Ellie's stomach tightened. Did you hear it just now? Callum shook his head. No, just in my dreams. Or maybe I imagined it. Either way, I'm officially creeped out. Ellie forced a smile, but her unease lingered. The dream had been too vivid, too specific to dismiss as a product of stress. There was something about it, something tied to the castle's history and the drummer boy's warning. The second dream. That night, Ellie tried to stay awake, but her exhaustion won out again. This time, she was prepared for the dreams, or so she thought. She found herself standing in a dimly lit chamber, the walls lined with rusted iron chains. The air was thick and oppressive, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Ellie recognized the chamber immediately. It was the same one she and Callum had discovered the night before. The hidden room beneath the castle that had collapsed moments after their escape. But now it was whole, untouched by time or ruin. A single figure stood in the center of the room. A woman in a long, tattered gown, her face obscured by a veil of matted hair. Ellie felt a chill as the woman raised her head, revealing hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. The drumming began again, faint but insistent, and Ellie turned to see the boy standing in the shadows. He wasn't playing the drum this time. Instead, he held his hands outstretched, as though offering her something. Ellie stepped closer, her heart pounding as she saw what he held. A small, jagged stone, its surface etched with strange symbols. The boy's headless form radiated urgency, and Ellie reached out to take the stone. But as her fingers brushed its surface, the chamber began to crumble, the walls shaking violently. The woman let out a blood-curdling scream, and Ellie turned to see her rushing forward, her hands clawed and reaching. Ellie woke with a gasp, clutching her chest as though the woman's hands were still wrapped around her. A pattern emerges. The dreams continued over the next several nights, each one more vivid than the last. Ellie found herself reliving scenes of the castle's history, from bloody battles to shadowy rituals. Each time, the drummer boy was there, his presence a constant thread in the fabric of her visions. She began documenting the dreams in her notebook, sketching the faces she saw and the symbols she couldn't understand. The jagged stone appeared in every dream, and Ellie became convinced it was the key to understanding the drummer boy's warning. I think he's trying to show me something, she told Callum one morning, her voice filled with both excitement and dread. Callum frowned. Or he's messing with your head. Ghosts aren't exactly known for their straightforward communication skills. Ellie shook her head. It's not random, Callum. There's a pattern. The dreams, the stone, the warnings, they're all connected. Callum sighed, running a hand through his hair. If you're right, then what's the next step? Ellie hesitated. She didn't have an answer, but she knew she couldn't ignore the drummer boy's message. The dreams were leading her somewhere, and she had to follow, no matter the cost. A new discovery. Determined to find the meaning behind the dreams, Ellie delved deeper into the castle's history. She spent hours in the archives, poring over maps and records, searching for any mention of the symbols or the stone. Her efforts finally paid off when she stumbled across an old journal belonging to a 17th century stonemason who had worked on the castle. The journal contained sketches of the stone, rough but unmistakable, and a cryptic note, bound by wrath. The drummer's stone holds the key to the curse. Ellie's heart raced as she read the words. The stone wasn't just a relic. It was tied to the castle's darkest secrets. But what curse? And why was the drummer boy connected to it? As Ellie closed the journal, a faint drumbeat echoed in her ears, sending a chill down her spine. She knew the answers were waiting for her, hidden within the castle's walls, and she wasn't sure she wanted to find them.